Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that is still waiting for Sue Gray. How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not bad, thanks. As always, we point you towards our Patreon special episode that we record just before we go into this, where we ramble a bit about what we've been doing in our lives. I've been playing with my new Xbox, and I hear you've been playing a lot of Doom, so people should go and check that out. I think we should just head on straight into the headlines, as we often do. So here we have from the Metro, Andrew, it's trial by jury. What's that about, Rob?
Yes, I think unless you've been living in a cave somewhere, we all know that, well, Prince Andrew, the Andrew formerly known as Prince, has been in a bit of hot water recently. Prince Andrew was a member of the royal family who has had connections to Jeffrey Epstein, allegedly, and it's alleged that he engaged in some actions with a girl who was underage at the time, and due to the prosecution of Maxwell's wife, that kind of paved the way to there actually being criminal proceedings against Prince Andrew. Earlier this month, he was looking to get the case thrown out of court by basically saying, oh, we had a written agreement with Epstein that you couldn't say anything, so this is why this can't go to court. That was thrown out. As a result, the royal family have now stripped him of his title, so he's just simply Andrew, and it appears now that he's wanting a trial by jury instead of any other trial to make sure that it's as fair as possible. So, quite a scandal for the royal family, and it's something that is dominating headlines, and I think would be dominating headlines a bit more, given that the royal family is usually the main concern of the British tabloids. But as we'll discover as we go through the other headlines and the main story, there have been a couple of other things that have been occupying the mind of the British press at the moment.
Yeah. I don't think I have much to add on that. It's a thing we should keep an eye on, really. It's kind of, is it unprecedented? People like the word unprecedented, but I can't think of I
can't think of like a member of a royal family being like arrested, never mind for the crimes that Andrew is being accused of. So yeah, I think it would be quite a big deal.
It's definitely a big deal, yes. Like, I mean, we definitely don't want to mitigate that. I'm just trying to think. Unprecedented, that's the word. Yeah, I don't want to add anything more on that point, really. It's going to be interesting to watch what happens from that. So moving on, in The Times, fears mount Russia will weaponize gas supplies.
Yeah, so this is the story bubbling on in the background of a possible World War III, if you haven't been paying attention, which again, I think would be making more headlines, but other things have got in the way. So we've got this situation where Russian troops are massing on the border of Ukraine for a variety of different reasons, and there are worries that if Russia were to have any incursion or any invasion into Ukrainian territory, this could start a proxy war between Russia and the United States, which, if you know your Cold War history, that's something that you generally want to avoid for fear of nukes, etc., etc. The very brief crib notes, background behind this is, do you remember back in 2014 when Russia took Crimea away from the Ukraine? That was an invasion that was essentially bloodless. There were soldiers who went in balaclavas but with no insignia on them, who just sort of occupied Crimea, said that, Crimea really should have a referendum if it wants to be part of Russia. There was a referendum, and surprise, surprise, they voted themselves into Russia, and that referendum and the results of that have been disputed because people felt it was very clearly an act of force by Russia to take that piece of land away from the Ukraine. And I think more words are being said by Vladimir Putin now, which suggests that he might want to incur into more Ukrainian territory again. Putin has made speeches basically saying that he describes Russians and Ukrainians as one people, a single whole. So he clearly feels that, that's why their two nations should be bonded. It was even a thing when they annexed Crimea that Putin wanted to try and justify it by saying, there are people within this part of Ukraine actually feel more Russian than Ukrainian, and that's why we had a democratic referendum to make sure that they could, come into Russia because they really wanted to, rather than the fact that there were loads of soldiers in their streets. So that's where we are. Russia's also a bit nervous about Ukraine because although Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, it's got this sort of alliance with those partners, which include Germany, France, and of course America, as well as Great Britain. And to have a NATO ally on your doorstep is something clearly Russia don't want. You don't want an opposing force to have a military presence within your sphere of influence, and Russia would clearly be against that. So at the moment, we don't know if Russia is just amassing troops to try and demand concessions from Ukraine and get them to walk back from joining NATO and try to persuade them in a quite a harsh way, but still not an actual invasion way of saying, hey, maybe you should not join NATO and just think about the consequences before you do so. You should remain neutral, and then we won't have to have these problems anymore. But yeah, it's causing a lot of tension within the international community. The amount of forces that Russia has amassed on that border and where they've come from very far east to sit there. And I believe the number I've got in this Wall Street Journal article is around about 100,000 troops there. So it's
not a small number of troops. It's definitely a reasonable.
Precisely. It's clear that like any conflict that happened in that area wouldn't be short, sharp. It would be, quite the conflict that Russia could sustain for a while. So it is a serious threat. And going back to the headline, because Russia controls a lot of the flow of gas into Europe, particularly into Germany, which relies on a lot of energy from Russia to keep its lights on, that's why some countries are feeling nervous. And although like Western powers have traditionally put economic sanctions on Russia to try and stop them from doing certain actions and get them to not attack Ukraine or not do anything else, that was what happened after the 2014 invasion of Crimea. People are worried that Russia could do exactly the same back, and energy prices, particularly those for gas, could skyrocket within Central Europe, and that would be another way of Russia putting their economic pressure on European leaders to make them think twice about acting if they go into Ukraine. So it's a very delicate situation. I've just given you the crib notes, but there's probably a plethora of other things that you can look at to make sure you've got a full understanding of the potential conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But yeah, of all the stories out there to keep an eye on, of all the foreign policy things that are happening, that's definitely the one you want to just make sure that you're aware of, because at any moment that could become like the main story on BBC. It could drive the headlines for sure. Yeah,
I definitely would recommend. So most people, I'm sure, are aware of all sorts of English language sources that they can go to that will be, generally of the opinion this is bad from Russia. For a slightly more interesting take, I would point people towards the Naked Pravda, which I think I've mentioned before. They are an English language but Russian produced podcast that gives you kind of a bit more of an insight into what it's like on the ground, which I think often we lack in our news sources. So I'll put a link for that in the show notes. And they're talking about what it's like in Ukraine at the moment. Again, I don't have much to add really. I think we've got potted crib notes there. I'm not a foreign policy expert, so I'm just going to leave that there as a crib notes of what's going on, and might come back to it for a bigger episode later, I guess, if we need to. So our next and final headline before we move into the main story tonight from The Express: PM, the clock is ticking. Sort energy bills crisis. With an exclamation mark for good measure.
Yes, this is the news that basically general inflation for the UK economy is at its highest rate in 30 years, having risen to about 5.4% in the 12 months to December. The main things that are driving this cost are sort of rising fuel and energy, which means that there are people who are struggling to keep the heating on in their home, people saying that they would have to choose between food and being warm for the night. And there are some truly awful stories of people being forced to make that choice. One woman saying that she was living off 3 Weetabix a day, basically, just so she could have the heating on. And although the Express is clearly, the Express says this is a crisis, it's one that particularly affects the poorest people in our society. When your basics are going up, particularly during winter, and when those basics include fuel. It was the food columnist Jack Monroe, who was somebody who does some great budget cookbooks and is somebody who personally had to live on food banks for a while. She pointed out to a lot of people that this measure of inflation is actually out of date, and it doesn't take into the proper impact of what happens when a pack of 10p noodles is raised to 15p. That would have very little effect on the inflation index that the Office for National Statistics use. But for that person who suddenly finds that the cost of their main food that they eat for the week is up by 50%, that's going to have a massive impact on what they do. And the same is true of fuel. So yeah, this is one of the many crises that Boris Johnson and the Conservative government are facing at the moment, and there's no clear sign about how you resolve that. Some things have been, one thing that Conservative MPs have been saying, that you need to stop the green tax that happens on fuels. All fuel has a certain proportion, all money that you give to the energy department, there is a percentage of it that goes to future green energy costs. The Conservatives say by knocking that out, you could reduce household bills by hundreds of pounds a year. Labour say that that's quite short-sighted and won't, it will be worse off in the future if we remove that. Actually, you have to just accept that energy companies within the UK are taking millions of pounds of profit, and you have to force them to lower their energy costs and go into their reserves and make sure that they can bring the price down for the consumer in the short term. While, one of the reasons why energy prices are so high is related to the last story. I've mentioned that Russia controls a lot of gas. If that was to calm down and Russia was to lower its gas prices again, then that short-term inflationary effect might be reduced, and Labour argue that energy companies could easily cover that cost. So yes, it's something for Boris Johnson and the Conservatives to decide. They're the majority. They have the majority in Parliament. They're the ones who are probably going to be laying down the law on how you resolve this, but it's clearly an issue that will be affecting every household around the country that relies on gas as one of their main power and heating sources.
Back to you talked about mentioning the kind of cost of living and how that's calculated. Saw a bit of conversation about this online, and I think there was a bit of confusion with it at the start, because I think some people were saying, oh, well, you could just, go to a different supermarket, things like that. But that's kind of not the point, is that often people who are in this situation where this would really, hurt them financially because they're not, well, probably being underpaid, I would guess, or are on benefits or something else, which means they, they have a limited income. They often don't have the choice to, go further afield. And as you mentioned, fuel costs, etc., go into that. Like, if you have a car and you can just drive to a different supermarket to get a better deal, that's very different to people who are stuck having only their local shop, for example. And then if the prices go up there, it really hits them in the wallet in a way that the average person might not feel. So it is important. And you need to kind of look at this in, just because you're I'm all right, Jack, is not a good argument against these kind of changes to measures. And I think that there's always a bit of a conversation about what the inflation index should be rated on every time it comes up, because there were some really weird things on that got removed in the mid 2000s, like quite old school measures that they slowly phased out, and they do try and change it every year. But I think the thing is, it doesn't reflect what people are struggling with.
Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, and I mean, I think everyone can understand that energy bills are getting more expensive right now. I was with Bulb. I still kind of am with Bulb because that's an ongoing saga. But they keep trying to charge more, but they're not allowed to. So they say, oh, can you put some more money in this account? And we're like, well, we haven't used that much fuel, so no. It's like, yeah. And then obviously these companies close, and then you're going to end up, next year we'll probably end up on a much worse deal for fuel, because that's how it's done. It's set for a year or two, depending on which energy plan you're on. Sorry, I'm rambling now, but you get my point. Like, I think the fuel, while some things people need to think a bit more about if they haven't immediately grokked the issue, I think most people can feel the pinch of the fuel prices going up. The fact that now you're paying to get fuel for your car in the region of what would have been ridiculous motorway prices until fairly recently. Yeah, it's just everything seems all over the shop in that regard.
A good time to sell your car, basically, is what you're saying?
Yeah, very good time to sell your car and only rely on train transport, which keeps going up in price as well. Everything is going up in price at the moment, and I think everyone's feeling that to some extent. So it's, if you're able to cut back, it's great, but not everyone can, and we have to be aware of that. So moving on into our main headline, I think you can probably guess where this is going, because you listened to what we just did as a headline at the start of our predictions episode. We'll just throw that in there. It's important. And then some time has passed, and it just hasn't gone away. So as I suspected, we've come back to talk about this again. So Partygate and PMQs. Where do we stand with this since we last spoke, Rob? Because I actually put the episode out about a week after we recorded it, but actually I was surprised to find it was still fairly timely, because it was like nothing really happened. We had that big PMQs and then nothing really happened for a week. It was just more slow drip reveals. But I think maybe we need to give a timeline since we last spoke.
Yeah, so I think we had breaking news at the end of our last podcast that we recorded, where it was revealed that Downing Street staff had partied the day before the Queen had to attend Prince Philip's funeral. And the details came out of that, which was quite embarrassing, that there was a DJ in the basement and that one of the partygoers broke Boris Johnson's son's swing in the garden. And although Boris Johnson was not directly involved, it was all clearly quite a bad look for the office at number 10, and how they bent the rules or broke the rules, while people as big as the Queen decided that she would sit alone at her husband's funeral to make sure that she put the message out there that everybody should be following the social distancing. And I think that was like another big moment in the Partygate scandal, just because it involves the Queen, and particularly when you appear to have disrespected the Queen and have to apologise to her for that. That's certainly not a good look for any government that's happened.
generally not a good look, but specifically bad if you're a conservative government. It's a bit different when it's someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who is, I think he was stated on the record as being a Republican. There are people who are against the monarchy, but generally they're not conservative prime ministers.
Yes, yeah, precisely. And then we had quite a dramatic PMQs where one of the Conservative MPs decided to cross the floor about 10 minutes before PMQs was meant to start. So by crossing the floor, we mean they defected from the Conservative Party and sat on the opposite benches amongst the Labour ranks. The MP in question is Christian Wakeford, who is the MP for Bury South. Now, it's quite a rare thing for MPs to do this like that, and it was almost certainly not a spur of the moment thing. People tend to think that this defection might have been months in the making, and particularly if you take when the first party allegations came out at the end of December, that timeline would sort of make sense. It takes a while for a party to court an MP and say how this would work and what they would provide and what assurances they would give that they can put policies forward that he can state to his constituents and still try and get away with it. I think it is worth pointing out as well that him getting Bury South, that was one of the old Red Wall seats, and he won that seat by fewer than 400 votes. So maybe from a personal point of view, it only takes, 200 or so angry letters into his constituency inbox that say, I voted Conservative last time, I will never vote Conservative again because of this party thing, for him to start to wonder if his position is not going to be intact come the next general election. So I think that's another reason that people maybe haven't focused on enough in this situation. He had a very small majority in his constituency, so it kind of made more sense for him to cross the floor and represent the 21,632 people who voted Labour in the 2019 general election. It's not the most undemocratic defection that could have happened. It's not like the Conservatives won by 60 and he's just defecting to the other party because of it. So yeah, that's very embarrassing for Boris Johnson's government, but some in the party felt that it also made sure that letters of no confidence didn't go in as well. It might have put things in perspective to realise, make those backbenchers realise that, by putting these letters in, we are undermining the Conservative Party as well as Boris Johnson. So maybe we shouldn't submit our letters quite yet. And as we speak, although we said letters were going in our last episode, they haven't appeared to have reached that magical number of 54, mostly because the main message from MPs and members of the cabinet is we've got to wait for the Sue Gray report, which I don't know about you, but that seems to be the most repeated phrase on television at the moment. I had no idea who Sue Gray was about 3 weeks ago, and now she consumes every waking minute of my life.
Last time we spoke, I think we did touch on this, but it very much feels like a diversionary tactic so that they can try and sit out the current annoyance by both the public and the Commons. But it doesn't seem to be sticking. I mean, at least that's my impression. I mean, maybe there are some diehard Conservatives who don't care. I mean, I have heard on a newscast, they had a few people call in who were like, why are we still moaning about this? He's leading the country, let's get on with it. And I'm sure there are obviously some people who believe that because his poll numbers haven't dropped to zero. But yeah, it seems like the tide is turning, but it seems like it's been very slowly turning, and it kind of shocks me that it's taken this long. And we've discussed before how Boris, stuff seems to wash off his back that wouldn't off another prime minister. But equally, yeah, how does one come back from this in the long term? I don't know.
So you've got this message to wait for Sue Gray, that, we won't know the official facts until Sue Gray has had time to pore over them. But of course, the report seemed to keep being delayed because allegations of more parties kept coming out. The most recent being that Boris Johnson had a birthday cake delivered to him and 20 members of staff sang happy birthday to him during a time where lockdown didn't allow you to have that many people in one place, and even singing was banned inside. That's one where they kind of said, look, that isn't a party. You've all had little get-togethers at work where cakes have been provided. We've got to stop moaning about this. Which I don't know if that came through with the general public. It's certainly a birthday party at a desk is something that most office workers can relate to, rather than the cheese and wine and the boozy parties that were happening at late hours that simply seemed so wrong. I think the birthday party story didn't quite hit the same with the general public.
I think the ambushed about cake jokes, kept it talked about for a few days.
Yeah, so like the ridiculous defences that Conservatives had to come up with when they were interviewed on live TV, the ambushed by cake line being a good one. It's and maybe that's the more telling thing. That's you talked about what damage it's causing to Boris Johnson, but it's also causing damage to his own political party, because the only time Boris Johnson talks about it is when he has to, when he's put in front of PMQs, and his line there anyway is wait for Sue Gray. It's the other Conservative ministers and backbenchers who go on these talk shows, who do the morning rounds, who are grilled quite intensely by people like Nick Robinson on BBC Radio 4, or you've got, I think it's Beth Rigby and Sky News. All of those have quite they're the journalists who really want to get to the minutiae of the question. They press these Conservative ministers, and often the time they're caught up a cul-de-sac, forced to say something ridiculous or simply just repeat the words Sue Gray until the questions go away. And it is in my opinion, it's paralysing the government, the fact that they can't get past this thing, and they are kind of wishing that it could move on to other issues that are the other issues that we've talked about in the headlines, like Ukraine, like energy. But there's nothing they can do, because this issue of parties has yet to have been resolved. And what's even more frustrating is that we were all expecting this report to come out on Wednesday, weren't we? When the build up to PMQs was like, is the report out? Is Boris Johnson going to say anything about it in PMQs? Is this the moment? Is it going to be reported in full? What appears to have happened is that the revelation on Tuesday that the Met Police would investigate these parties, something that a lot of people have been calling on for a while now, because they are, if they did go ahead, then they would be breaches of COVID law, and therefore could criminal charges be pressed against Number 10 office, or maybe even the Prime Minister himself? The Met has agreed to do that, but the side effect of that appears to be that the Sue Gray report either has to be censored, because you can't have things that are being investigated by the police. Sue Gray can't be said to give an opinion on that, and that be the definitive opinion. If the police thought otherwise, that would maybe undermine the report in some way, shape or form. And two, how embarrassing would those things be for the Prime Minister if they came out? Or if they were subject, if Sue Gray said it and then it was again proven to be false in a criminal organisation, what liability would she have? That's why you have those laws around people saying, in an ongoing investigation, I can't talk about that, because not only do I not want to incriminate myself, I don't want to, lead people down the wrong line when there are people already investigating.
So one more thing to add on there is, I think, so it was a bit confusing. We were expecting the report. I would have fully expected before we recorded again, we'd have heard the report. But then, as you say, there was all these shenanigans. The Met Police announced they're going to do an investigation, and people are like, oh, does that mean the report can come out? One thing that I think got pointed out as well on, again, I think it was on Newscast, is that, the report needs to be very correct. So there was already a lot of pressure on Sue Gray to release this perfect report that will give all these answers. But I think there's also a pressure to ensure that the report that is released to the public has as very the smallest amount of redaction possible. Obviously, there may be, such and such was in this place, has to be redacted for security reasons. But I think the idea is they want to ensure the report is very accessible, the stuff it covers. So I think that's part of the difficulty with it, is my understanding from what I've heard. But yeah, we'll have to see. I mean, it could come out. This is one of those things. It could come out tomorrow, and it will completely invalidate this little chat we're having as part of the episode. But yeah.
No, I think another reason that the Sue Gray report has, or at least what some of the conspiracy theories about the Sue Gray report being delayed, there was a theory at the start that an investigation is good for the government because it pauses everything, it stretches it out, and usually when these things come out in the end, it's quite like it's watered down. Sue Gray is a civil servant. She can't accuse the Prime Minister of anything too directly. How scathing could it be? It's not going to be as scathing as any of the hit pieces in the media, so let that be the official record and we can all move on. There are rumblings, at least within the media, that the report is maybe actually quite scathing and quite bad for the government, so that's why they don't want to publish it in full, or having certain parts redacted might be very good for them. So this delay, or this possible neutering of the report by having to cut a few things out that the Met are investigating, that's how the government are able to stop it looking as bad as it all is. It's the main story of the day. It was the one that dominated our podcast last time. Until it goes away, I'm sure we're going to keep mentioning it. This isn't just this isn't another wallpaper gate that can be brushed to the side and there's a nod. footnote. This captured the public's imagination back in December, and this drip, drip, drip of scandal that's come out has gone on through January. Now, I know a few people might be fed up of the Prime Minister being asked about parties all the time, and certainly I was going to make this point about PMQs, but I've made the point to watch the last 3 PMQs, and Boris Johnson's responses to Keir Starmer, he might as well just record them on a dictaphone and play them. He doesn't need to be there. They are the same standard responses of our economy has recovered more than any other European country. We've had the fastest booster rollout in the whole of Europe. Youth employment is at a record all-time high. I did a Brexit, yay for me. It's kind of those 5 points that he just rattles on whenever there is any criticism leveled at him. It's like, forget about that criticism. I've done these 5 great things. We should focus on that instead. Which is, it's getting boring. And the fact that all Labour can say is like, you've done a bad thing, you should resign. And he stands up and says, no, actually, I did a Brexit, you're bad, it's tiring. I don't think the general public get anything out of that level of debate. It's not even a debate. It's just two sides shouting at each other.
It's just deflection over and over again.
Yeah, precisely. There's no analysis of the points or any great revelation. It's just restating the same thing. So maybe if it stretches out into another week, the impact will be lessened, but I can't see how they're going to get away with not publishing it for another week. The media pressure on Wednesday was at such a fever pitch, and certainly people felt angry about it on Friday that it wasn't going to come out. And even Parliament is going to be, people were worried on Wednesday that they would have to suspend Parliament and make sure that Parliament couldn't meet until everybody had time to digest the Sue Gray report, because the Prime Minister has said it would be, as soon as it is made available, he will make a statement on it in the Commons. There needs to be time to debate that response and have all sides have a fair view on it before they discuss it. There was talk of stopping Parliament on Wednesday afternoon just to make sure everybody had that time. So I think if it does come out, it will be on like a Monday or Tuesday morning. We're going to have a long time for Parliament to look at it rather than it being snuck out on a Friday afternoon, because you don't want everybody waiting on it over the weekend before we can all have that's the Partygate. I did just want to touch on why more letters haven't gone in, and why I think Boris Johnson's position is maybe a bit safer than we think at the moment.
I mean, standing here with what I know of the news, I'm kind of like, why is he not gone? And I get that there is, I think we discussed this a bit when we were trying to predict, will Boris go this year? There's a fine line to walk if you're looking towards the next general election between letting everything be Boris's fault for as long as possible so you can jettison him in the run-up to the election. But also there's, on the flip side, is if this goes on for too long, then no one trusts the government and you get back into a kind of, like Thatcher era problems. So it is interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on why this hasn't quite gone that way, because it seems to me like you'd want to get him out the door sooner rather than later, especially with the polls as they are. But also we are a fair way from the general election. So you can understand why maybe they would want to milk this for a bit to ensure it's just Boris and his cronies who get kicked out.
I think the main reason is that there's an awful lot of stuff going on at the moment. Like we've said, Ukraine, energy crisis, inflation high, a new rise in national insurance that's meant to come in, and that was confirmed today that by Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak that will go ahead. That policy in particular is quite unpopular amongst Conservatives. Labour hate it as well. They think it will hit the poorest people most severely, and Labour's proposed plan for that would be to have a bigger tax rise on the rich, and particularly corporations, to cover the funds needed to fund the NHS. That's the reason behind this rise, or at least that's what the government have said it is. But that rise in national insurance paints Rishi Sunak in a bad light. It's one of we were saying like how during the pandemic he was the fun one with the nice stuff to say, hey, we're going to give you all this money on furlough, or hey, you should go out and eat at these restaurants. He was the one giving the nice advice, while, Matt Hancock and the others had to give the more difficult rule. That's kind of how he got his reputation through COVID as one of the potential successors to Boris Johnson. The rise in national insurance has undermined him, as well as the fact that he said that he's going to write off 4.2 billion in fraud that happened under the COVID schemes that helped make sure that people had funds during those furlough schemes as well, which is something that's proved quite unpopular amongst people, particularly Labour, who say that, hey, if that was benefit fraud, I don't think you would leave it quite alone as you have done. So that does undermine his case to be PM. On the other side, you've got Liz Truss, who, apart from a few dodgy interviews where she's had to defend Boris Johnson's party actions. It was also revealed that she spent £500,000 of taxpayers' money taking a private jet to go from the United Kingdom to Australia to get a trade deal sorted and come back. Again, it's those kind of like little stories that are being leaked about those leadership contenders and internal worries in the Conservative Party if Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss are the type of leaders who could win those red wall seats again. That's what's worrying Conservatives. There's no clear leader. There's no one person who they can all rally behind, and the ones that were there, Truss and Sunak, don't seem like they're quite in the position yet to do it. So it's almost like they're just saying, yeah, Boris Johnson, we'll keep you in power to try and deal with these crises we've got going on, because boy, I wouldn't want that job, and it would be very easy for Boris to walk away, although it'd be very embarrassing if he had to resign or got pushed out of his party because of the party allegations. There is a potential for you to cock up more of the British like economy and everything if you get balls wrong on inflation, etc. So yeah, it's not a fun time to become prime minister, and I don't know how many Conservatives actually want the potential poison chalice at the moment.
And of course, if we went through that, we'd have to go through the whole process again, like when we got Boris Johnson in and when we got Theresa May in, where you waste like a week or two of all these shenanigans while they vote for the next leader. And while the current prime minister would still be prime minister until that goes through, it does very much distract from what they're able to do politically. And, with rising tensions and stuff, you can understand why people might not want to pull that right now, because there are other concerns than just what the public think about a few parties.
Precisely.
No, I guess the question then, given we just did our predictions episode, do you still feel confident in your prediction that we're going to have Boris through this year? Do you think this is just a short-term reprieve for Boris, if you know what I mean, like the things we've just discussed, and it will fall over in the middle of summer when there's less news happening? Or do you still stand by your previous prediction that he'll make it through the year?
I'm going to infuriate you with my answer here, because, and I mean this, truly. I think we have to wait for Sue Gray, and by that I mean,
yeah, you can't draw a conclusion without seeing what's in the report.
Yes, yeah. If that report is awful, if it says that Boris Johnson was dancing on the tables to Pure and Simple by hearsay, then yeah, I think there's no way that he can stay, and it becomes entirely untenable for him to do so. If that report is just middling bad, or the excuses that the Conservatives have reeled out so far about how, these people were working very hard and the office at number 10 is kind of like a house and kind of like an office, and if these are unprecedented times, that's why people didn't socially distance. If they're able to sort of get away with that and keep 30% of the country on their side, then I think Boris Johnson can get through this. If the Sue Gray report is terrible, then yeah, he's a goner. But I still don't think he'll resign. He'll have to be pushed out of that position. He's made it very clear that he's not a resigning man in everything else that he's done.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, in fact, I got a YouGov question from the paid YouGov survey the other day, which was like, do you think Boris Johnson will resign? And I was like, I don't think so. I still don't think he will resign out of choice. Like, he could be put into a position where he's forced to, by some backroom shenanigans. I think it's much more likely that the way Boris goes is by those letters to the 1922 committee, as in he won't choose to resign until he's forced.
Yes. I think the main point, the only way that Boris Johnson resigns is if the Sue Gray report proves that he lied to Parliament. There's been a lot made of that breaking of the ministerial code, and those who break the ministerial code are expected to offer their resignation. Of course, the ultimate arbiter of the ministerial code is the Prime Minister, which undermines that slightly. So he still could get around it that way. But if the evidence in the Sue Gray report is so hook, line and sinker that he can't deny it anymore, that becomes a huge issue for him. So I think that's the only way that he actually resigns, as a matter of, I have to follow the law or I will undermine years of parliamentary procedure. But yeah, that would be another pickle for another podcast we'd have to discuss if he ended up in that situation.
It's a rather quick episode. We've rushed through all the topic. I think it does help. We've laid the groundwork for this previously. Rest assured, this will probably still be in our headlines for the next few episodes, at least, I would imagine. And we might need to do as you say, it very much depends on what the Sue Gray report entails, whether we have to do like a big deep dive, like when there were all those Brexit documents coming out and we had to go through, almost line by line. Or it could be that we go, oh, that was a bit boring, I guess, and then carry on with our normal programming. So we'll just have to see.
I just wanted to sum up as in a way, we're all waiting for Sue Gray, really. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
it's just all of our content, all the news, everybody kind of is depending on it. And at the moment, we're in this wonderful limbo. There'll be calendars will be written to have post Sue Gray and pre Sue Gray rather than AD, BC.
BSG and ASG.
Yeah, definitely.
Going forwards. Okay. So I think we should have a quick look at the polls before we disappear off. So as always, we're looking at the Politico poll of polls, which is a summary of all the polls. There's been a bit of movement since we last spoke. And actually, maybe this is another thing where Boris might be a little happier, is it seems that there's an initial drop for the Conservatives and Labour increasing. It now seems that the Conservatives are gaining, they've only gained 1% and Labour have dropped 1%, but that means they're slowly getting closer together. Not drastic, nothing drastic. A 1% change is not much to write home about, but it does maybe suggest that the opinion on the Conservatives is recovering, which seems wild given what's currently going on, but other people clearly have different opinions of all these shenanigans. And the Lib Dems have also gained 1%, I think, since we last spoke. Yes. Well, they may have been on 11% last time we spoke. Hard to check from this. But yeah, a 1% fluctuation in the Lib Dems is not really going to make a big difference.
No, and looking at those polls, when the Conservatives are at its lowest, 32%, Reform were at 3%, and now the Conservatives on 33%, Reform are on 2%, and that's where I would expect most of the like transition to go from which party you're voting for to the other one. Like if there's one thing we said at the end of December when we said that this party thing was a pickle for Boris Johnson and why suddenly everybody hated him, it was because not only did he have to say that we shouldn't have partied, he was also imposing Plan B and the Omicron restrictions, which the people who would vote for reform, they would be against that too. So he was hemorrhaging people from all sides. Now the country has sort of come out of that and he's lifted restrictions more. That's at least going to get some of those reform people back to him. So he's at least kind of won back one side of the party. And in particular, those people who voted reform and thought those regulations were stupid in the first place, they're the ones least likely to be fussed about if Boris Johnson had a party at number 10 Downing Street or not. They already think the regulation didn't apply to them anyway. That's kind of like their whole deal during the pandemic. So yeah, that's I think that's one like kind of reason off the top of my head why I think he might have recovered some ground in that status. But still, to be now not quite 10 points, it's not the quite 10 points it was, but to still be behind Labour, where the Conservatives were ahead for most of the year before, it certainly shows that this Partygate thing is still a net negative for Boris Johnson, and how he can recover to those 40% levels is yet to be seen.
The last time before this, when Labour even approached the Conservatives, was in November 2020. Which would have been, again, that's pre the vaccine bounce, and it would have been when there were all those problems going on. And Labour has only been ahead in the recent months since the general election, I think. So, yeah, it is a big deal. The last time Labour was technically ahead was prior to the 2019 general election, like midway through 2019. So it's a long way from where it was. Also, wow, I mean, look at that time when Reform had 22% for like a week. It's funny looking at the historical averages, because it's like, I can't believe for like a week that was a thing. I'm just going to share that because it goes back for like 6 years, but it can maybe go in the show notes as well. But it's impressive that was ever a problem. Just that massive dip. There's no other point where Labour has been that low and the Conservatives have never been that low. And that bit where it was that weird bit where the Lib Dems were like, we're going to try and run for Prime Minister, and we were all like, are you sure?
That was back when Reform would have been the Brexit party, and Brexit was like the main issue. That's when Labour suddenly said, we're going to call a general election and let's have it, because the polls were absolutely mad and they thought that the Brexit party would destroy the Conservatives in the general election. And as it turned out, no. Turns out if Boris Johnson says he's going to do a Brexit, those people vote for the Conservatives anyway. So yeah.
Yeah. We need to at some point do like a long-term view special where we talk about like the wild ride it's been since we started the cast. But of course, for anyone who wants to hear our opinions, they can go back through our back catalogue and listen to what we said at the time. But I think a retrospective or something would be quite good at some point in the near future, maybe. I don't know when we will decide that it's worth doing. Because
silly season, maybe a silly season. That's a good time for a bit of navel gazing.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, I think we have discussed this topic enough for today, and we'll see. Maybe if the Sue Gray report comes out and it's terrible, we might terrible for Boris, not terrible as in poorly written, obviously. then we might have to do like an emergency episode. We haven't done one of those in a while. We'll see what happens. So watch this space for the next episode. As always, Rob, thank you for joining me. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Unparl Podcast. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. And you can find us on our website at parliamentary.observer, a domain name I'm still impressed they let me own. And if you feel that you want to get access to those bonus Patreon episodes we mentioned at the start of the show, or if you just want to throw $1 or $2 our way just to help support the show, the running of the website and the other shows on the network, then go to patreon.com/TTSS and sign up there for bonus content. I think other than that, there's nothing left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. This is on. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Hello.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
Hi. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you took the schoolyard conversation of which one of my favourite fictional characters would win in a fight? Well, wonder no more. Join me, Chris, and my co-host Matt every other Sunday for Mish Mash Mayhem, and you can find out.